Hey everybody, Aiden here, and welcome to my millionth channel. Today, we're going to talk about background blur, or bokeh. Bokeh is more of the effect you see on these lights. Background blur, a little bit different, just the blurriness of the background, okay? Sort that out. So specifically, we're going to talk about background blur in relation to sensor size. Here is a Lumix GH1. It has micro four thirds sensor, which is a teeny tiny little sensor relative to full frame. The teeny tiny sensor size is why a lot of people say that micro four thirds creates less background blur than full frame sensors or even APS-C sensors. However, is that even true? Kind of, and we're going to talk about it later. In fact, you may notice that this shot right here is a little bit tight. It's very close to my face. You can't even fully see the top of my head. And I'm going to talk about why that is. Let's talk about what creates background blur. There are a variety of factors. The main ones are, number one, aperture, which is why wider aperture lenses, so lower f-stops, create more background blur. It lets in more light. But the other big factor is focal length. So greater focal length lenses create more background blur. So that's why a 50mm f1.8 lens creates more background blur than this 25mm f1.7. The other factors include how far away you are from a background. I'm right on this background, which is why the background blur isn't super crazy, even though I'm using a Canon 85mm f1.8 lens to film this. And that 85mm f1.8 lens that I'm using right now is on a speed booster on a micro four thirds camera, so it is around a 60mm f1.3 lens right now, which creates an equivalent focal length of 120mm on full frame. Specifically a 120mm f2.6 lens. This right here is Canon's Nifty 50. It's a 50mm f1.8 lens that's super popular for a number of reasons. Number one, really cheap. Number two, it's 50mm, which is a relatively natural focal length, meaning it looks kind of natural. It's useful in a number of different settings. This is for the Canon EF mount, which is for either full frame or APS-C. Today we're going to be talking about full frame. Right, so when you put this on a full frame sensor, it creates this natural looking field of view, and it creates a decent amount of background blur due to its wide open aperture. Now, this is Canon's Nifty 50, this is Lumix's Nifty 50, and it's actually a 25mm, and the reason for that is because micro four thirds has a 2x crop factor. So a 25mm has the equivalent focal length of the 50mm, right? Makes sense. This is an f1.7. So, spoiler alert, this Nifty 50 creates more background blur than this 25mm f1.7. So there we go, full frame must create more background blur, right? Not really, because guess what? If you put this 50mm f1.8 lens directly onto a micro four thirds camera, it creates the same amount of background blur. If anything, it actually looks like more background blur because of the extra compression. That's because the way a crop sensor works is it's literally cropped in. So, because 25mm creates the equivalent focal length of a 50mm, when you put a 50mm lens on a micro four thirds camera, it creates the equivalent focal length of a 100mm, because you multiply both the focal length and the aperture by 2. However, like I said, this creates the same amount of background blur when you put it on a micro four thirds camera. That's because it's simply cropped in. If you take an image taken with this lens on a full frame camera and you blow that up 200%, that's the same image you get on a micro four thirds camera. If full frame truly created more background blur, as people say, then one would think if you put this lens on a micro four thirds camera, it would create less background blur. However, that's not the case. In fact, if anything, it would create the illusion of more background blur. And I'll show that right now on a nifty website, not sponsored, called DOFsimulator. It simulates depth of field and background blur on a variety of different camera systems, sensor sizes, focal lengths, lenses, etc. Okay, so here's DOFsimulator. I've got a few different things programmed in. So these are all with the Canon EF 50mm f1.8 STM. However, two of these are 35mm full frame. So we have one with the model at 3 feet and then one with the model at 6 feet. And then we have the micro four thirds with the same lens with the model at 6 feet. So we can see here, the background blur at full frame is 4.46%. Now, if we go to 50mm on the micro four thirds camera, the background blur is at 4.47%. So you can see the actual background blur is about the same. The main difference is the level of background compression. So as you can see, the background looks much closer, and that is due to the longer focal length. However, the actual background blur itself is around the exact same. So this is going to be much closer than if we got the 50mm f1.8 at 6 feet and then we cropped all the way in. But you can see actually there's a little bit more blur here than here, even if you crop in. But anyways, it's the actual percentage of the background blur that stays the same. The main difference is the compression effect. So then if this lens directly put on a micro four thirds camera creates the background blur on a full frame camera, then why do we say that full frame cameras create more background blur than micro four thirds cameras? Again, like I said, in order to get this equivalent focal length, that 50mm that people love because it's such a versatile range, you need to have a 25mm. And this 25mm f1.7, like I mentioned earlier, creates significantly less blur than this 50mm. That's because this 25mm f1.7 has the same amount of background blur as a 25mm f1.7 put on a full frame camera. So if you were to have a 25mm f1.7 lens and you put it on a full frame camera, that creates the same amount of background blur as a 25mm f1.7 lens put on a micro four thirds camera. However, because it's on a micro four thirds camera, you get the equivalent field of view as this lens, right? Is that sort of making sense? This sounds a little complicated, but it's really not. So okay, to summarize, this 50mm f1.8 lens creates around the same amount of background blur when put on a micro four thirds camera versus full frame. However, because it creates an equivalent field of view as that of a 100mm, if you were to put a 100mm lens on a full frame camera and that had that 1.8 aperture, it would create a shit ton more blur than the micro four thirds camera. However, if you put a 100mm f3.6 lens on a full frame camera, that would create the same amount of background blur as this lens put on a micro four thirds camera. However, this 50mm f1.8 lens is a 50mm f1.8 lens regardless of whether it's on a micro four thirds camera or a full frame camera. So in reality, what does this mean? It means if you put a full frame lens on a micro four thirds camera, which you absolutely can do using an adapter, I do it all the time, you're going to get the same amount of background blur as a full frame camera. So you get that full frame look, right? Not really. What we call the full frame look isn't only the background blur, but it's the width of the lens. So full frame creates a wider field of view. So when you see a movie and there's a wide shot with a wide field of view and you have that blurry background, that's the full frame look, because you can get that blurry background on micro four thirds easily. However, it's always going to be a tighter shot. And that's why this shot is so tight. If I were to use a full frame camera to film this with the 85mm f1.8 lens, then it would look wider than this does. Because again, right now with the speed booster, this looks like a 120mm f2.6 lens on a full frame camera. However, it looks like an 85mm f1.8 lens on a micro four thirds camera. The only difference is the apparent field of view. Therefore, if you want to get the equivalent field of view as this 50mm, you need a 25mm. And this 25mm f1.7 is going to create less blur than this 50mm because it is a 25mm, and longer focal lengths create more blur. I know this video was a little chaotic, but I hope it kind of clears up some of those misconceptions, because sometimes it's sort of enigmatic and people say, oh, full frame just creates more blur because more light is hitting the sensor. And that's only kind of true, because in the end, it's the lens that makes the primary difference. I love to use this Sigma 30mm f1.4 combined with a speed booster on my micro four thirds camera, because that creates the equivalent of a 40mm f2 lens, because it creates a 20mm f1 on a micro four thirds camera, which comes out to a 40mm f2. You get a wider lens than that 50mm, but also at that f2 aperture. I'd like to end this by saying I'm not actually an expert in this, so I may be wrong, and if I am wrong, please clear it up in the comment section below. I'm open-minded. If I'm wrong, fuck it, I'm wrong. That's fine. I'm not an expert in this. A lot of what I'm relying on is that DOFsimulator website. So if DOFsimulator is wrong, then oopsie daisies, they're wrong, and I'm wrong for relying on them. Okay, bye-bye. Subscribe if you want, or don't subscribe. Dislike, like, I don't fucking care. Comment, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Bye.